this lesson, we are going to make a case study of the population trends in Singapore from the early 1960s to the present day. So far, we have learned about what are the three branches of the Singapore government and how each of them ensure the smooth and effective governing of the country. We have also learned how the action taken by the Singapore government are based upon some belief or way of thinking. These beliefs or way of thinking are known as principles. The four principles are: 1. Opportunities for all. 2. Rewards for work. 3. Anticipate change and stay. And lastly, leadership is the key to success and survival. To help you remember what are the four principles, the first alphabet of each of these four principles makes up the word oral, O-R-A-L. Now we are going to learn how these principles are being applied or considered to meet the changing population trends in Singapore since the end of the Second World War. Our study of the changes in population trend in Singapore will be divided into two parts, namely, part 1 will consist from 1960s or even earlier to about 1980. During this period, you will see a huge increase in population and how the government needed to take certain measures to stop the increase. Part 2 will be from early 1980s to the present days. In this part, you will witness a substantial decline in the population growth and the steps taken by the government to encourage more to have babies. You will also study how the government dealt with a population where more and more citizens are getting older and older. Alright, population trends in Singapore, part 1, from the early 1960s to the end of the 1970s. Now let's look at the population brief or the composition in 2012, which is 2 years ago. Now in Singapore during that year, the estimate was about 5.3 million people. Of this, we have 3.8 million who are staying here, and they're divided in two parts. First, the citizen population, which is about 3.3 million, and the PR population is about 5.33 thousand or half a million. Then we have the non-resident population, those who come here and work and go back, and they consist of about 1.5 million people. We also noticed that in 2012 there were more women than men in Singapore. And more alarming was more people are getting married, but at a much later age, 30 over years and above. And women are also giving birth later, 30 to 34 years old. Alright, early population growth. That means what happened in the early years after 60s and 70s. Alright, look at this graph. It shows the birth trend in Singapore and in KKH. KKH stands for Kadang Kerbau Hospital, which is at one time the largest, biggest baby factory in the world. Alright, look at this circle, which is shaded in grey, which is not dotted. Now during this period is from 1942 to 45 during the war years. And during this period of time, the Japanese occupation, there was no census taken of how many babies were born. And therefore, during that part, the graph was unable to show. But you also find, what interestingly was that the population was quite low at that time because life was difficult and people were afraid to have babies. But the rate portion, this is the highest rate of growth of population that comes in from 1960s to 1965 or 66, right up to 70s. And the last part here going into the 80s, that shows a declining population growth. Alright, what is the due to this? Now, the years where the baby population was growing tremendously were due to the post-war baby boom. And this was during the time when the war was over and peace was restored and people felt it's time for them to have a larger family. And this is what you can find. Asian traditions and big families are usually welcome. That is why in the past, in the 60s and 70s, you find a lot of families with many children. In 1970s, there were 2 million people. In 1990, there were 3 million, and in 2001, there were 4 million people. Now, all this is due to mainly to political stability. We have a good government, strong government, and there was no natural disasters like floods or even volcanic eruption or earthquake. So population rose very quickly in the 60s and right up to the 70s. All right, problems of population growth. Now when you have population growing at such a tremendous rate, and there will definitely be a high degree of unemployment in the 1960s, and this gave rise to crime rate and overcrowding, giving rise to slums and squatters. In those days, you find that there could be as many as 50 people staying in a house. Look at this in Chinatown. This is a picture of Chinatown in the 1960s. Healthcare was short and poor hygiene given rise to diseases. Right? Look at the hospital. The early years, the beds were so bad and people had to sleep on very uncomfortable situation. And there was lack of education opportunities and no government subsidies. Look at this school. This is an old type school, and the facilities were not as good as what you have today. And how did the government do to control the population that was growing so quickly? Firstly, the Family Planning Board was set up in 1966. This board was set up with the sole aim of trying to find out ways and measures to control the growth of population. Now this is the old building. This building is the old family planning building down in Dunnan Road, somewhere near Newton. It's now become the National Cancer Society building. Then they also implement the 3 to 5 years plan so that they could help to slow down the growth of population. Right? You can see the nurse teaching people, the lady, what to do to help to slow down the birth rate. Then there was a need to families, and they stopped at 2 and to ensure the replacement of population. Various measures were encouraged to have small family. Posters such as this on your left will show you what the government are trying to educate the people to slow down the birth rate. And so, slower growth in population. Now look at these figures here. You will find that in 1990, the number of males from 2024 was 94.2. But by the time they reached 2000, the population of young people had gone up to 95.2. On the other hand, if you look in 1990, the number of males was 10.9. And by 2000, you find that the number of males have increased to 18.3. This shows very clearly that the population has slowed down and more people are getting older. All right, so what caused this trend? Why is there a sudden decline in the years after the 1960s? One, There's a change in education mindset. Men and women became more educated because from the 70s onward, the government introduced a lot of education policies that try to upgrade the education level of both men and women, and many of them became more and more educated. As a result, they think more of advancing their career than getting settled down. 2. Then also, by the 1970s, their parents began to worry that if they go to work, there are less people to look after the children at home. So there was a need to have childcare facilities, which at that time was still very lacking. 3. The cost of hiring childcare. If the parents go to work and if they don't have their grandparents to look after them, they have to hire maids to look after, which also will add a cost to them. And this is another factor to distract them from having more children. Lastly, work commitment. As people become more educated and as society becomes more advanced, people tend to work more in the office and also prefer to enjoy life. As a result, they do not see having children as a priority. All right, more problems for the country. Now, if we do not have more children or more babies being born, the first thing that we will realize that in time to come, there will be a shortage of manpower in business industries to drive the economy and growth. As you know, Singapore is a trading hub for the world, and business come in tremendously if we want our country to progress. And if we don't have enough manpower to meet the needs of the business industries, we will find that this economy will suffer. 2. As the population grows older, all right, we need resources to care for the growing population. You know, older people will need hospital, and healthcare costs will also rise. Number 3, investors will be unwilling to set up the MNC. MNC stands for multinational company in Singapore, and insurance, for example, because they do not have enough manpower to run those big, huge companies. And lastly, more importantly, you'll find that with less baby being born, there will be less for us to defend our country by the 1980s. All right. So what did the government do to increase population growth? 1, set up child development account. 2, matching of parental contribution to child's saving. 3, use of Medisave for child delivery for the first 3 children. In the past, you can only use for the first 2. And lastly, quicker flat allocation for parents with more than 2 children. We'll keep our next part for the next lesson.